Good afternoon and welcome to Georgia DNR's Lunch and Learn webinar. I'm Emily Wingo of the Georgia DNR Floodplain Unit. First, a little housekeeping. We are in listen-only mode, so please make sure your mic is muted. If you're having Wi-Fi issues, you may want to turn off your camera and any other programs you have running. Please be sure to make note of the chat feature in either the upper right-hand or lower right-hand of your screen. Please use the chat for communications as we will not be taking questions by audio. Jim Kilinowski of Dewberry is monitoring the chat and will try to help you with any technical matters. Please be sure to post to everyone when using the chat. We are offering 1 hour of continuing education credit for CFMs. To receive the credit, you must be logged in separately, answer all poll questions during this session, and provide your name and email at the end of the presentation. Poll questions should appear as a pop-up window on the screen, but may appear in the chat box. If you're having issues answering the poll questions, please check the chat box and use the radio buttons to respond. A copy of the presentation will be emailed to all attendees. Also, a survey link will be provided at the end of the presentation. We appreciate you completing the survey so that we may improve these webinars in the future. We are recording today's webinar and plan to post the video on georgiadfirm.com. Okay, with that, let's get started. Today we have a presentation about no-rise determinations. Our presenter is Joe Martinenza. For those that don't know Joe, he's a professional engineer with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. He has over 25 years of experience in floodplain hydrology and hydraulics, with over 20 years working directly within the National Flood Insurance Program. He currently manages the flood risk projects for the Georgia Flood M.A.P program. He assists communities in determining BFEs, NFIP regulation interpretation, and NFIP processes. And with that, I'll now turn it over to Joe.
Thanks, Emily. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us during your lunch hour here. Hopefully we make it worth your while. No-rise certification. When it comes to one thing that I feel like we see over at the DNR, community struggling with is what is a no-rise? What do I do with it? What am I supposed to be doing with it? So hopefully we can get to the bottom of that and resolve some of those mysteries. So this is no-rise certification and how to review it. And already I've got a problem, so let me turn off that. There we go. So I'm going to go over what a no-rise certification is. Then we'll talk about the submittal requirements. We'll go over the review process. So how do you review a no-rise? And then I'll give an example of a fairly typical no-rise project and kind of walk through it. This will by no means cover every engineering problem that can arise, but I think by the end of it, you'll see that you'll know what you're supposed to be doing, and you'll realize when you get to a part where you may need additional help. At the end, we'll have some time for questions, so feel free to stick around for that. So before we get started, we really need to make sure we're on the same page as far as definitions. The first one is development. What is development? Here's a nice big long sentence, but really it's any man-made change. So anything that a person does in a floodplain is considered development. So that covers all those things there. I'm not going to read them all out, but anything, whether you're putting it in or taking it out. Floodway may be something that you're familiar with, but I want to put up a quick little graphic here and just make sure we understand. So this is a cross-section, typical floodplain. You can see where the water touches both shores or both banks. If we were to place some encroachment in there, place some fill predominantly, you can see we're squeezing that channel. So when we squeeze that channel, the water has to rise. What the floodway is the amount of encroachment you're allowed to have and still keep that surcharge under 1 foot. So when you see a floodway on your map, that's what it is. It's basically how far in you can encroach without getting into the floodway, and the channel will still be able to convey the flood water without increasing the water surface elevation by a foot. Off to the sides of the floodway, but still in the floodplain, you have the flood fringes, what we call the flood fringes, and I may use that term a few times. during this. So this is what a typical cross section would look like. So when we're talking about this, you can kind of keep this in the back of your mind. What is the NFIP requirement? Because as FPAs, you said the community says, well, as joining the program, the community says we'll follow all the rules and the regs. What does the regs specifically say? Well, if you look at section 60.3, paragraph D3, you'll see that it says the community shall prohibit encroachments within the adopted regulatory floodway, showing that there will not be any increases in flood level. And of course, it says some other things in there, and we'll go through that. But that is the gist of it. You are not allowed. You are to make sure there's no encroachments in the floodway causing a rise, any increase in flood levels. So what does that mean to the FPA then? Well, this all happens before you issue any development permits in the floodway. You need an analysis or certification stating that the development will cause no increase in flood level. Basically, that certification is what we call or refer to as the no rise. So when someone says, what is a no rise? Well, it's just a certification. It's a piece of paper. It has a certification on it, has some signatures. It says there's no increase in flood level due to the project. You need engineering analysis proving that there's no impact based on that proposed project. And that impact can be in base flood elevations, in floodway elevations, and floodway widths. That floodway widths gets people sometimes. They don't, communities don't realize that, and they end up with a violation. So it's all three of those things we'll be checking for. That certification needs to be certified by a professional engineer. And again, this gets conducted. You have to do all this before and issue this certification before you issue any permits. You keep those no rises in your file. You don't submit them to FEMA because there's no impact on the maps, right? No rise, no impact. So FEMA doesn't need the information, but you'll need it because when we do come around and we ask you, for a community assistant visit, we may ask to take a look at all those no rises. And if there's ever a problem down the road, you'll want to have that on file. And believe me, we do see that quite often around the state where no rises weren't issued or it isn't clear if one was issued because we don't have a record of it. This engineering analysis, when I say proving, I mean it's supported by technical data. So what does that technical data look like? Well, let's start at the very beginning. If you have a map and it has a floodway on it, there was a engineering model that was used to create that floodway. That engineering model is known as the effective model. What we're going to be doing to that effective model, or what the requester or the developer will be doing, is they will be modifying that model to show pre and post project conditions. We're going to be you are going to be comparing the pre and post project models to verify that there's no increases in BFE, floodway elevation, or floodway width. So, and again, we're going to cover this stuff several times, but I want to kind of get the definitions out there. If FEMA gives you a model, an effective model, let's say it's done in HEC 2, which is a really old and outdated model that no one uses anymore, you're allowed to take that and rerun it into, say, HEC-RAS or some other model, as long as it's calibrated to the FIS profile to within a half a foot everywhere along that profile. And that model's FEMA approved, and you can get a list of the FEMA approved models. I would say 99% of all models in riverine areas are HEC-RAS nowadays. Is pretty much the gold standard. One important thing to note is not all projects are no rise, and that's okay. But what do we mean by rise? I think we need to define that, because I think a lot of people we've seen will interpret that differently. A rise is considered any increase more than 0.00. The accuracy or the reporting accuracy of most hydraulic models are 0.00. So basically, any increase is considered a rise. There's no rounding. You can't round. If it's 0.01, You have a rise, there's an issue, you can't submit a no rise. I just want to make that clear, because while the communities may know that, the developers and the engineers a lot of times say, well, it rounds down to 0, so we're good. They think they have a clear no rise, and it ends up delaying their projects. Why is that the way it is? Well, if you were to have, say, 5 or 6 projects along a stretch of stream, and each one of them were 0.1, 0.3, 0.4, all round down to 0, eventually all those are going to add up to something significant, a foot, 2 foot, if you have enough projects in there. And that's what is needed. That's what FEMA's trying to avoid. And when I say FEMA, I probably really should say the federal government, because this is a federal regulation. If there's a rise, it's not a problem. You just need to pursue a conditional letter of MAP revision. So you go back to developer and say, well, there's a rise. You need to go back and do a conditional letter of MAP revision. Take a look at part 6512. It outlines all those steps you need to take in order to get your project approved. It does take a little time, but that is the route that is needed to go if there's a rise. The other thing about a no rise is it cannot exist without some form of mitigation. If work is done in the floodway, then technically there's going to be some sort of increase. What do we mean by mitigation? Well, there's several different ways to mitigate against these rises. This is probably the most common. I think those of you who've processed these before or seen projects before, you've seen this. If you're going to fill in part of the floodway over here, upstream or downstream of it, you're probably excavating some of that channel, basically balancing that cut and fill so that the conveyance and the channel's the same, so that there's not an increase in water surface elevation. And this is fairly common. And the fill and the cut and the fill don't have to be done adjacent to each other. It can be done upstream or downstream as needed to make the situation not cause a rise, and that's absolutely fine. But usually, some sort of cut or fill is needed for a project. Another one that we see, but not quite as often, is using what's known as the hydraulic shadow. So here we have a picture of a building. Let me get my laser pointer turned on. We have an existing building in the floodway, and you can see these 2 triangles on either side of the building. Now the flow's coming this way. The areas just upstream and downstream of that existing structure is what's known as a hydraulic shadow, meaning the water's stagnant. There's not a real velocity happening there. And probably you can do something like put proposed additions in those areas, and it won't cause an increase. And that's fine. Now, that doesn't mean that they say, well, we're building this just downstream of the existing structure, therefore it's a no rise. No, they still have to go through this no rise process. But I think that's another way in which people have shown that they're able to do a project and not cause an increase. The thing you want to watch out for when you're doing hydraulic or doing a structure or some work in a hydraulic shadow is that their models have cross sections running through that shadow, so you can get an accurate determination of what those impacts are, if any, if that makes sense. Turn off my laser pointer. First poll question. So this is where it's going to pop up somewhere for you in your chat or but let me read this off, and Jim, let me know. I can't quite see what's going on. I'm not sure where to look. Is the poll question up?
Yes, the poll question is launched.
Let me read this to you. So, which of the following would be considered a floodway encroachment? A new culvert placed in a channel. B, new bridge that spans the floodplain. C, new grading in a subdivision that places fill in the floodway. Or D, A and C only. So take a second, answer that, and it's absolutely critical you answer it if you want to get C's at the end of this. And Jim, I can't see what people are typing, so let me know when it looks like everybody's responded, please.
Will do. And if you can, please try to answer by clicking on one of the radial buttons in the chat. If that's not showing up though, please feel free to enter your answer directly in the chat.
Give you a few more seconds here to get that done. Want to make sure everybody gets credit for listening.
All right, I think that's just about everybody.
All right. Well, the answer is D, A and C only. So it begs the question, why isn't B considered an encroachment? You're doing a bridge. Well, it's not an encroachment because there's no work being done in the floodplain. The new bridge is going to span the floodplain. Therefore, there's no work being done. Therefore, you don't have to worry about a no rise. Now, I can tell you that probably doesn't happen too very often, but I have seen it happen. And that this was a question to kind of get you thinking about what is a floodway encroachment. Again, it's any work that's done in a floodway, any work. Very good. Looks like I think I saw a bunch of answers popping up. So it looks like I can't see, but it looks like a lot of people got the right one. Let's talk about the submittal then. So obviously there's got to be some sort of submittal made to you, right? So that you have something to review. So we'll talk about the models a good bit, and we'll talk about the documentation itself and what to look for. The first is a set of 3 models here. So this is where a lot of people kind of get tripped up. So I'll kind of go through it, and then I'll go through it again in the example. And then if you have any questions still, you can always refer back to this at the end. Or refer back to this because, again, Jim and Emily are going to send this out to you. So the current effective model. So that you ask FEMA, say, FEMA, I'm going to be doing some work on this stream. I need the effective model. Whatever they send you, that is what we're calling the current effective model. It could be an electronic form. It can be a PDF if it's a really old HEC2 type model. Mostly here in Georgia, you should be receiving HEC-RAS models, but we still have some HEC2 models out there for sure. So what you take that current effective model, and the first thing you're going to want to do, first thing the engineer is going to do is they're going to take that model and they're going to run it on their computer using their software. We're calling the duplicate effective model. The reason we create that duplicate effective model because we want to make sure that when we run things on our own machines, that we're getting the same results that are in the effective model. That's known as the duplicate effective model. The corrected effective model isn't necessary for all projects, but most will have a corrected effective. It still represents effective conditions, but it can include a few things. One is corrections. So if the engineer gets the effective model and they notice that there's a culvert and the culvert was modeled as a 48-inch, but it's really just a 36-inch, well, then they would go ahead and make that correction and call that the corrected effective model. Also, if they need to add more cross sections to more accurately reflect their proposed project, you would do that here in the corrected effective model as well. And that'll make a little bit more sense when I run through the example. But so most of the time there's going to be a corrected effective model because they'll want to add some cross sections if nothing else. Then we get into the meat of the models, the existing and the proposed conditions. So remember now we've got that corrected effective model. And we want to update it to make sure it represents what's out there right now, including any changes since effective. Why do you want that? Well, we want to make sure the project is not causing increases above what's out there right now, based on the fact that you added some. If you're adding cross sections, if you made some corrections, things like that can change, and we want to make sure that they're not being penalized for adding more detail, and that could potentially happen. The proposed conditions model, you take that existing condition model and you put your project in there. So you start modifying the cross sections, show cut and fill and structures and whatever else needs to be that's part of that project. Before I slide on to the documentation, keep in mind, just kind of go over that modeling again. You got your effective that comes from FEMA. You got your duplicate effective, which is basically them just running it on their own machine to make sure they didn't make that it getting the same answers that the effectives got. The corrected effective, where you add some cross sections, potentially correct any errors. Existing conditions, where you would update it based on exactly what's out there right now, using better LiDAR, let's say, better topographic information, survey, that sort of thing. And then you do your proposed, which you're putting in your model. So those are the models, and we'll hit that again here in a minute. Documentation. So you should be getting a report. If somebody wants a no-rise, they need to be submitting a report to you. Now, here's a list of things that should be in the report, but this isn't necessarily all-encompassing. If you look at that last bullet point or checkpoint there, anything you feel you need to do your no-rise review, you should ask for. I'd say a lot of engineering firms do a fairly good job of putting all the information you'll need in there. But just make sure that it has, you'll want to know what sort of procedures they did, what they did to the models. You'll basically want to see some sort of comparison between the effective, the existing, and the proposed results. Some sort of map that would probably look something along lines like this. So it has the effective floodway and floodplain, the effective cross sections, additional cross sections, clearly marked, your site location, modification, basically so you can get a good feel for what the project is. Because just sometimes you can spot potential problem areas when you're doing your review just by having a map and saying, well, I need to go take a look at what's happening here because this looks a little weird or whatnot. Review. Okay, so they submitted the document to you. Here's our report. We'd like a no-rise. They send a little review certification in, and step one is for you to kind of read that. I have read review certifications where right in the certification coming from an engineer, it says our project doesn't cause any increases above 0.02 feet, thinking that it rounds down to zero, which it doesn't. We learned that any rise means it's not a no rise, and right away I think you could save yourself some headache, but just by grabbing that and saying, well, this isn't a no rise, we need to talk about this a little bit more. So read that review certification. I think it'll definitely help. Make sure it has everything it needs as well. And we kind of went over that earlier. Take a look at the map. Like I said, the map is going to be very useful. I think all you would know that. You know how to do your jobs and read maps to figure out what a project is. Read the entire report, because a lot of times they'll have some assumptions or some things in the report that they did to their models that isn't quite right. Just really doesn't make sense from a good engineering practice standpoint, and you'll want to follow up with questions. Because so if you just look at the models and you look at the mapping, you say, oh, everything looks great, but then you read the report and they're like, oh, wait a minute, they assumed this. No, that doesn't sound right. Let's talk about this a little bit. You'll want to get a copy of the effective FIS, the effective firm, the GIS data if you have that sort of capability. A lot of times the requester will send those things to you, but if not, then you'll need to kind of grab those from the MAP Service Center or your own private files. So step 4, you'll want to locate the project on the firm, see if the project's actually in the floodway. If it isn't even in the floodway, then a no-rise isn't something that's even necessary. Find the profile for the stream in question, find the floodway data table. Both of those things will be in the FIS. You can take a look at the summary of discharges as well. I have seen instances where requesters have gotten showed that their project causes decreases, but what they've done is they changed the discharge. They lowered it so that is what causes the decrease. It's okay to change the discharges, but if you do, it needs to be done during that uh, existing condition model so that and it carry over into the proposed model so you're comparing apples to apples. Hopefully that makes sense. If it's a really old model, you want to make sure that there's not a datum conversion issue. If they were supposed to do a datum conversion and didn't, or they did and they did it incorrectly, just kind of look for that. Be aware that models really before the mid 90s, I believe, probably need some sort of data conversion for sure. Step 5, you'll want to compare the effective model against the FIS or firm. So make sure the model they're submitting as the effective matches the information that's on the firm, that's in the floodway data table, that's on the profile. So basically, you're just going to find the cross section in the model. If it says elevation 100, then the floodway data table needs to say elevation 100. The profile needs to show an elevation 100. Just ensure that they actually have the effective model. Don't make the assumption that if you receive that if someone says, well, I got this model from FEMA, that FEMA got the correct model. Also, make sure there's no LOMARs in that area. And if there is a LOMAR, make sure they're using that model and not some older version of the model. Step 6, you'll want to take a look at all the models, looking for modifications, looking for any sort of errors that may put in there, taking a look at the results. Now, I realize not every FPA is an engineer, and this step may be difficult for some, but there are some things you can do. I don't want to say, well, actually, I'll say this. You got a professional engineer who's submitting this to you and signing off on it. So it's not like they're going to uh, purposely, I wouldn't think, make errors. And you may not be able to find the errors, but down the road, the community is ultimately responsible if errors are found. So there's some ways to get around that, and I'll go over them in a bit. But basically, you need to review those models and make sure they make sense. You want to have a summary table, basically comparing the pre-project and post-project, or basically the existing conditions and proposed conditions model. Most of the time, engineers will submit that in the report. If they don't, you can create one, or even better, just go back to them and say, hey, can you put me together a quick summary table, show me the results so that I can quickly, cross-reference those. Then again, then you'll just go in and compare the 100-year water surface elevations, the floodway elevations, and the floodway widths. If you see no increase between any of those, and there's no errors, and you got everything else you need, you've got yourself a no rise. If any of those look off, then you need to work with the developer, the engineer, and get those things fixed or get the project modified so that they're mitigated for. So I said before, if you need help, and some communities do need help, you can always request that FEMA review these. That's good and bad. That's good for you because it really puts it back on FEMA to say whether it's a no-rise type situation. But they have to submit what's known as a conditional letter M.A.P revision. Not only does that cost them money, but it'll also take time. In fact, I would say if it only took 3 months, that would be very fast. Just to get it into the system and get it out of the system, it takes a while to do a CLOMAR. And if there's any kind of questions or if the project's kind of complicated and difficult to review, it could take 6 months or more. But you can get that from FEMA, especially if you have a complicated situation and you're just not comfortable looking at it. Go ahead and send that off. Have them send it off to FEMA. It will irk the requester and the engineering company a good bit, but you can do that. That option is out there for you. So let's take a look at an example and kind of try to tie a lot of this stuff back together. What we have here is we have a multi-use trail that they want to put in. It'll be 10 foot wide. It'll connect two parks. You can kind of see it there in the yellow. And they want to put in this multi-use trail. It's going to be concrete. There's going to be some retaining walls. There's going to be some landscaping. That's the gist of the project. So taking a look at, they got the effective model. So here's the stretch of stream. These three cross sections, I can't see, Q, P, and R are the three cross sections for that area in the effective model. You can see there's a floodway. You saw from the previous map that they are definitely going to be doing work in the floodway. Any work is a encroachment or considered development. So the effective model has these three. The first thing that you do is you take that effective model and you look at their duplicate effective. In this case, they went from HEC2 to HEC-RAS. Now, I can tell you from experience, when you take an old HEC2 model that you're only going to get a PDF of and you input that data in the HEC-RAS, you're going to get different results, mostly due to the fact that HEC-RAS has an updated methodology for computing. It basically computes the water surface elevations in a different manners, and that's fine. But remember, what they have to do is they have to replicate that effective model within a half a foot. So you take a look at those three cross sections, and I'll get my laser pointer out. You have the HEC2 elevation. You have their duplicate model, which is now HEC-RAS. Look at the difference. It's a half a foot. At all those cross sections, it's a half a foot or less. Therefore, you're okay. They're okay. Their duplicate effective model is fine. Now, to get these, they may have had to change the things in the HEC-RAS model. Maybe they played around with Manning's N values or little things, little tweaks here or there, little tricks that engineers can do to basically what you're trying to do is calibrate your duplicate effective back to your effective model. That's absolutely fine. Just read the little section in there where they said it. If they're making little tweaks to some of the parameters, that's absolutely fine. If you have a question on it, you can ask them, but that's typically what you have to do to calibrate the models. Hopefully that makes sense because we get that question a lot. So now you have your duplicate effective model. It's time to get your corrected effective model. This is where you're going to add your new cross sections. Our trail was running through here, if you remember. Therefore, we need to put some cross sections in there. Otherwise, you won't be able to analyze anything because the only cross sections would span the project. Of course, it would have no impact because there's no cross sections. You want to make sure they've added cross sections through their project area. Make sure they've added enough. For this, I wouldn't just put one or two cross sections and call it good. I would want to see numerous cross sections in there. Maybe not necessarily this many, but if you're an engineer and you do this sort of stuff, it'll kind of make sense to you. If not, just make sure they've added some cross sections so that we can see what the impact is. The corrected effective model is where you can dump in the new topography as well, existing condition topography. Then you want to create your existing conditions model. We have the corrected effective. We added all these cross sections in here. This is, that first effective cross section. And the engineer noticed there was a pedestrian bridge that wasn't included in the effective model. So let me go back one. We have here, and we have a cross section here, and then there's a pedestrian bridge somewhere in here. It wasn't modeled because they didn't pull a cross section through there. The existing conditions model is where you would add that. So when I said the existing conditions where you add any changes that happened since the effective model, this is it. Now, if somebody built that pedestrian bridge after the effective model was done, that could be a problem, and I hope you kind of can see this point. If let's just say that was built 10 years after the effective model, well, it should have a no-rise attached to it or a LOMAR or something to that effect because work was done in the floodway. But if it was built before the floodway was first put on the map, and it just didn't have a cross section running through it, they can add it to the existing conditions model, no problem. And if that trips anybody up, please ask a question at the end, because we do run it. While the requester wouldn't be dinged for this necessarily, the project would be stopped and the community would have to deal with that potential violation. And nothing would be done in there until that got fixed. And that could take a while. But in this case, it's there. It just wasn't modeled because they didn't put any cross sections down there. So we need to add that to our existing conditions model. So here's what our map looks like. The proposed conditions model, we already have the new cross-section locations. We already got that bridge in over here. Now we just need to put the proposed elements in. So remember I said something about a retaining wall. You'll want to put in that new concrete trail itself. I said there was going to do some landscaping in there that'll have impacts to the Manning's roughness coefficients. That's where you would start changing those up. Basically get all those elements into your proposed conditions model. This is kind of threw this in. This is a cross section, a typical cross section for this project. It's probably hard to see, but there's a little magenta line right here. This is the trail, and you can see this little piece here. We're cutting out part of the cross section, and over here we're kind of adding some fill in. So this would be the fill. This would be the cut that's kind of offsetting it. In this case, the mitigation factor of it. This is just one cross section. Of course, it would translate through all the cross sections that the trail touch, but that's kind of what you would see there. Hopefully, if you got a project, they're going to send in some plans that kind of look like this. This may enhance your understanding of the project. We have that 10-foot wide trail. We have 3-foot shoulders on either side. You can see they're planning on doing concrete. These sorts of things you want to make sure you have, just make sure you understand what's going on. But you would probably need those for permitting anyway. So they built all their models and they submitted this nice little table for you, the existing versus proposed 100-year water service elevation. So we got a nice column for existing. Now this isn't effective, this is existing. Remember, this is after we added we did the duplicate effective, we did added cross sections, made a corrected effective, then we made an existing conditions when we added that bridge. And this is our proposed with all of our proposed elements. So if you subtract the 100-year proposed, or the 100-year existing from the 100-year proposed, you get the elevation difference, and do that for the floodway and the floodplain. So you look at your table and you see that there are no increases. There's no increases. You didn't find any errors in the model. They submitted the report. You got the certification. You can feel confident and issue that no rise. You can then start working on their permits. You can take that no rise, stick it into your filing cabinet, or however you file those things. And if we ever, or when we come to visit, we may ask for them, and you just pull them out, and that's that. You're good to go. So I just want to wrap it up real quick. I went through this quick because I really wanted to leave some time at the end in case there's any questions. But a quick summary: a no rise is just a term that says that you're doing work in a floodway and you're causing no increases. Communities are responsible for reviewing and maintaining this documentation. Not all projects are no rise, and that's absolutely fine. You can do work in a floodway and cause an increase as long as you go through the conditional letter map revision process and get FEMA's approval. And there are some steps in there they have to take to show why it's a good idea to let that project go ahead, even though there's some rises. And make sure the no rise report is certified by PE. And basically our whole intent of all this was prove there's no increase between existing and proposed conditions. That's based on the effective modeling. I want to say, the process itself is fairly simple. We find that some floodplain administrators have more capabilities in reviewing things than others, and that's fine. But as long as you know the process, keep this handy when it comes to you so you can kind of go through those 8 steps. And if you do that, then you're well ahead of the game, and you're probably okay. If you have any questions, here's my information. Uh, I have a fairly good understanding of modeling. I got a really good understanding of things that people may try to do to trick the modeling. If you need help with that, if you think something doesn't look quite right, and that was a joke, I apologize. I shouldn't say they're trying to trick the modeling, but it's something that isn't done quite right. Also, Brian Shown in our office, a lot of you probably already know him. Besides knowing all this stuff, he's actually worked in several different communities and has a really good, intimate knowledge of how these things are done and how to go about them and what questions to ask. And is just a great resource. Here's both of our information. I'm going to put it here. Open it up to questions before Emily gets over this last slide, I think. So you can drop some questions in chat or come off your mic and ask, I guess would be fine. Am I saying anything wrong there, Jim?
Nope, that's exactly correct.
All right.
Fantastic. I do have a question I wanted to throw out at you, if you, since we're waiting for folks to put questions in the chat. Can base level engineering data be used in no-rise determinations?
Base level engineering data is, I'm going to say no. The short answer is no, but it's not no because the base level engineering data is no good. It's just that it's not. It's based on approximate methods. There is no floodway modeling for base level engineering, so there's no way. Everything has to track back to that effective model. You have to get that effective model from FEMA. You have to build from that effective model, your corrected effective, your existing, your proposed model. So while base level engineering can be used for lots of cool things like coming up with BFEs and zone A areas for a starting point to create a new detailed model, you can't, it doesn't have a floodway with it. So you can't, you wouldn't be able to use that. You have to go back. Everything has to tie back to the effective because we're proving that we're not changing or having increases back from the effective. That's a good question. I see hands raised, but I don't know how to.
Yes, Charles Richards has his hand up.
Yep, that's me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. I think you ended up answering my question. So we're looking at extending our future floodplain. And I understand if that's beyond the zone AE through our ordinance, we can still choose to regulate that. I guess we could request a no rise. We just wouldn't be able to submit it to you all, or.
Well, you can if typically when you're dealing with future conditions, if you're extending out your floodway and you're making a future conditions floodway, but it really comes down to, is it going to be shown on the flood insurance rate map? So if it's not shown on the map, but you have it in your internal system, you can certainly regulate to higher standards. Yeah, you can put that out there and make folks use that. It's just part of your higher standards. It's not a requirement from the FEMA side because it's not on their flood insurance rate map. But if you have that data and you provide that data to others, you can certainly do that, typically through some sort of ordinance change, or would be my guess, just so it's, on the books, so to speak. But yes, you can. I see Brian.
Yes, Brian's got his hand raised.
Twice.
Twice, once, whatever.
Yeah, once. I'm sorry. I see a 2.
Get rid of it. Thanks for that wonderful saying how much knowledge I had and that kind of stuff. Thanks, Joe. Also on a side note, I figured out something that is really cool. I'll let you have it, Joe, later on. But back to this project or doing the no rises. One thing to remember is if the project is filling the ground in above the BFE in the floodway, then there's another section of the CFR, the Code of Federal Register stuff, that will require you to change the map. So you have to do a Clomar-Lomar. So if the fill work goes above, or that you're filling everything in, and say if you're putting a building out there, oh yeah, you got to definitely do a Clomar-Lomar to get that building out or removed from the special flood hazard area. So if the ground goes up above, the field goes all the way up, then yes, we're changing the map. Make them do a Clomar-Lomar. That's if you're in the floodway. Just a note, if you're in the fringe and they're filling it in, say put a parking lot in or something like that, it'd be very good if you got them to do it, to do the Lomar-Clomar, to show the flood map changing. That's the whole point there. If all the work is down below the top, and I'm not saying 1 inch below BFE, I'm thinking like a couple of feet, then you don't necessarily have to change the map, because the water can still flow across that land. So that's just my comment, and let Joe and Emily have the show back.
Thanks, Brian. I
Okay.
appreciate that. That was good.
One other question. What if the project is not built as proposed and the encroachment causes an increase in the water surface elevation?
That's a good question. That kind of ties back to the part of my presentation where I said the community is ultimately responsible. So if first of all, if they issue a permit for a project to be built and it wasn't built as proposed, that's problem number one, right? And that's something that the community would have to work through on any project. If it's built in a floodway and it causes an increase, then it's a potential, then it's a floodway violation. You're in violation of 60.3 D3, which means FEMA gets involved as administrators of the program. They would have to get involved, and then they would want to see there would be semi-regular meetings and updates to make sure that the project was mitigated. The same would be true if they just skipped the whole no rise by accident and issued the permits. If anytime it would basically be a flowway violation, FEMA would get involved, and they would be looking. They would come back and say, "All right, community, you got to make sure that this is mitigated for and it gets back to existing condition water levels." And I can tell you that they do not care if it costs $1 or 20 million. It just whatever's needed to get it back to what it should be is what they're going to be looking for, and they work with you. It's not like it's going to be something like, all right, if you don't fix this by tomorrow, it's a big problem. But over time, if it doesn't get resolved, they can move towards suspending the community and stuff like that. I think that's very rare. But my point is, the community is responsible for that, even though the developer may have changed the plans after the fact. It doesn't matter. Ultimately, the community has to make sure that gets fixed and is on the hook for it.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Joe. I do appreciate you taking the time out to give us this great presentation on no rise determinations, and I hope this helps everybody else. I see Carvel Edwards has got his hand raised, and we'll take his question real quick.
Yes, Joe. If you do the duplicate model and then you realize there's been a change and you do the corrected effective model, and you notice a rise, what do you do?
That's fine. I guess that's a good question because I didn't really explain that very well. I mean, that point of it. The reason we're building those different models is so that when you actually get around to doing, all right, let me see how to explain this. You do the corrected effective, you put in that, you fix those errors or whatever it is, and the water surface elevation goes up. But see, now you're building your existing models off that corrected effective. So that error, that increase is built into your existing model. You put your proposed on top of the existing so that water surface. So when you're making your final comparison, proposed back to existing, not back to effective, but back to existing, the fact that those corrections made a rise doesn't matter because we're not comparing that far back. Does that make sense? Probably not. It's something you have to stop and think about.
It makes
You're
sense,
basically,
do you need to address the Clomar in that? Do you need to inform FEMA so they know to not? Okay, that was my.
yes. Well, when they get done with the project, and anytime, if you corrected errors, yes, anytime the floodplain is changing, you'd want to submit that to FEMA in terms of a letter of map revision, so that the maps can be changed. It doesn't impact the fact that they still be able to give out a no-rise. It doesn't impact you giving out permits. But at the end of that project, you'd want to correct that mistake. Now, there's no way for FEMA to really follow up in this case to know that happened because everything's happening at the local level. But yeah, technically you would need to submit a letter of map revision. Does that make sense? But it doesn't hold anything else up.
Yes, that makes sense. Thank you.
We do have one question in the chat. Where do you find flood study data to give the design engineer?
Well, if we're talking about the modeling, you would request that from FEMA. They have a thing called FMIX that you can go through. You can search on their website to have it, or I can get that information. If it's a newer model, like from 2008 on, the state of Georgia, we have those models on our website, georgiadfirm.com, spell out the word Georgia. And you want to, you can get those models from there. The rest of the effective information, such as the firm maps, the GIS data, the FIS text, that all can be taken from the FEMA Map Service Center and downloaded. We should have some videos of that sort of thing on our YouTube site, which if you just go to YouTube and search for Georgia flood map, you'll see a whole range of videos explaining how to get models, how to basically download that sort of information that you're asking for there. Or you can just point the requester directly to those, or they can just give me a call and I'll be happy to point them in the right direction as well. I do that a lot.
Okay. There was a follow-up comment to the question: if fill in the floodway may require an EPD permit and community stream buffer permit. I'm assuming that you're referring to the stream buffer requirements, Walter. And how does that work in with the flood study data? Yes.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to additional permits that are required, whether it's Army Corps, EPD, whomever, it's up to the community to make sure that all those permits have been received before they issue a land disturbance permit. I think that's how that works. Brian, correct me if I'm wrong. I know they have to get all the permits, but I think they have to get them before the community would be able to issue a land disturbance permit. And I put Brian on the spot there.
Yeah, that is correct. All permits, whether we're doing no-rise studies or low-mark Clomars or just regular permitting in the floodplain, all the state and federal permits are needed to be in prior to issuing the permit.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We're getting close to the top of the hour, so I'm gonna call it on the questions there. But please feel free to add in your questions along with your email address so that we can follow up with you if you have any other questions. Because we will be keeping the chat open just for a few more minutes. Again, thank you, Joe, so much for that presentation. Everybody be sure to mark March 1st from 12 to 1 on your calendar for our next Lunch and Learn webinar. The registration link will be emailed. Please make note of the survey link in the chat on the screen and on the screen. Again, we greatly appreciate you completing those surveys. Yes, the slideshow will be sent out to all attendees. If you are interested in continuing education credit for today's session, you must put in your name and email address in the chat now. And again, like I said, the presentation will be emailed out to all attendees. If you are requesting continuing education credits, those certificates will be emailed separately. Again, our next Lunch and Learn is scheduled for March 1st, so be on the lookout for that invitation. With that, thank you again for attending today's event. For those who don't have any other questions, this is the end of our Lunch and Learn webinar. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.